The wind carried dust across the open land, whispering through dry grass and rattling the old boards of the trading post at the edge of town. A silence lingered there, the kind that settled heavy in the chest, broken only by the creak of a hanging sign or the nervous stomp of a horse tethered to a post. Folks came and went, some with their heads high, others keeping their eyes on the ground, as though unwilling to see what stood tied near the post. She was the last of her people in this place, the last Apache woman brought down from the hills, bound by ropes and watched with cold eyes. Nobody called her by a name. To the men who gathered to stare, she was little more than an unwanted prize from a war that had dragged on too long and left behind too much sorrow. Her dark hair fell tangled across her shoulders, her wrists tied, her chin lifted, though her eyes burned with a kind of defiance that dared anyone to look too long. She had not spoken since she was brought down from the mountains. They said she was the last one left after the raids ended, after her band had been scattered or killed, after the fires burned out. Now she was here, placed before strangers who muttered about what to do with her. The soldiers wanted nothing more than to be rid of her. The townsfolk did not want the burden, and yet nobody stepped forward to claim her fate. The West was changing. Railroads pushed across open plains, cattle drives thundered through valleys, and new farms sprang up where the buffalo once roamed. But beneath the sound of hammers and axes, beneath the cries of new beginnings, there lingered the quiet grief of a people nearly erased. She stood as a reminder of it all, a shadow of a world that would never return. That was why the men shifted uneasily, why mothers pulled their children closer, why nobody spoke of her except in hushed tones. She carried history in her silence, and it unsettled them. At the far end of the street, leaning on a wooden fence outside the feed store, a farmer watched with tired eyes. His clothes were worn, patched at the knees and elbows, and his boots bore the weight of years of hard work. His life had been long days and lonely nights, a struggle against soil that gave little, and a house that echoed with emptiness. He was known in town as a quiet man who kept to himself. Some called him kind, others pitied him, but all agreed he carried his solitude like an old coat he could not take off. He had not meant to stop and watch, yet his gaze lingered, drawn to the figure at the post. The sheriff, impatient and red-faced, shouted to the crowd that if no one came forward, the woman would be sent away, carted off to whatever place the officials decided. It was cheaper that way, easier for the town, and safer, they claimed, than leaving her in their midst. Whispers moved through the crowd like dry leaves in the wind. Some spoke of danger, of revenge, of old wars that still haunted the land. Others muttered that she was just a woman, hungry and tired, who had lost everything and now had nothing left to fight with. Still, no hand was raised. The farmer shifted his weight, his heart thudding in a way he did not understand. He had seen many hard things in his life, but something about the stillness in her eyes made him pause. She was not broken, not in the way the others thought. She was bound, yes, but not defeated. It was that strength, quiet and unyielding, that stirred something in him. He thought of the nights when the wind howled against his small home, when the silence inside pressed down on him heavier than any storm. He thought of the mornings when he rose before the sun, eating bread gone stale, walking fields that seemed endless in their emptiness. For years he had lived as though waiting for something, though he could not have said what. And without meaning to, he wondered if this moment was it. A trader spat into the dust and offered a cruel laugh, saying no one in his right mind would want her. He said she was nothing but trouble, a mouth to feed, a burden to bear. Some nodded in agreement, eager to move on, eager to forget, but the farmer stayed where he was, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on her face. The sheriff's voice rose again, demanding a decision, his patience worn thin. The soldiers shifted, ready to haul her away, their hands rough on the ropes. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others relieved the choice was not theirs to make. The farmer's boots felt heavy as he took a step forward. He had not planned to speak, had not planned to draw attention. But his voice came low and steady, carrying over the restless shuffle of the crowd. He asked what price would free her. The words fell into the dust like stones into a still pond, sending ripples through the silence. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers rose again, sharper now, as though this simple question had unsettled the ground beneath their feet. The sheriff blinked, caught between surprise and suspicion. The trader laughed again, though his laughter carried less strength now. The farmer did not flinch. His eyes stayed on the woman, who had not moved except for the faint tightening of her shoulders. For the first time since she was brought down, a flicker crossed her face, so slight it might have been missed. It was not gratitude nor relief, but something else, something deeper that no one there could name. The sheriff cleared his throat, muttered about rules, about the cost, about the dangers of such a decision. He spoke of responsibility, of the burden this would place on one man's shoulders. The farmer listened, silent, patient, as though weighing every word. His heart pounded, but his resolve did not waver. For years he had endured loneliness like an open wound. For years he had watched life pass him by while he toiled in the dirt, unseen and unheard. Now, for reasons he could not explain even to himself, he was ready to step into the storm. The crowd leaned closer, eager to see if he would falter, if he would back down under the sheriff's sharp gaze. But he did not move, did not look away. The air seemed to tighten, the dust holding its breath along with the people who stood in the street. The woman's eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto his at last. Something passed between them, wordless and heavy, a bridge built in silence that neither rope nor law could break. The sheriff hesitated, his hand resting near his belt, his lips pressing into a thin line. He named a price, one steep enough to make most men turn away, one meant to end the matter before it could begin. Yet still the farmer did not step back. The murmurs of the crowd rose into a low rumble, filled with doubt, curiosity, and disbelief. The woman's fate hung in that fragile moment, its balance between chains and freedom, between being cast aside and being chosen. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, and the world seemed to narrow to just the three of them, the farmer, the sheriff, and the last Apache woman who had outlived her people. All waited for the farmer to speak again, to seal his decision, or retreat into silence. The tension pressed close, thick as the desert air before a storm, until even the horses stamped nervously, sensing the weight of what was to come. And then, with the crowd watching, with the sheriff's hand still poised, with the woman's eyes fixed on his, the farmer drew a long breath, ready to answer. The farmer's breath lingered in his chest, as if the air itself resisted leaving him. He knew every ear in town bent toward him, waiting, judging, ready to turn his words into gossip that would echo down these streets for weeks to come. The sheriff's narrowed eyes cut across the space between them, holding a question that carried more weight than the silver coins he had just demanded. The woman's gaze, steady and unreadable, pressed harder on him than either. She was no stranger to eyes upon her, yet this moment carried something different. She waited, not pleading, not surrendering, but standing in silence as though her fate had always been hers to endure. When the farmer finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. He said he would pay it. The words cracked through the hot stillness, and the crowd shifted uneasily, mutters rising. Some scoffed, shaking their heads at his foolishness. Others leaned closer, unable to hide their curiosity. A man with little more than his land, his tools, and the calluses on his hands had just pledged what many considered a small fortune, but no one doubted him. He was not a man known for words wasted. The sheriff studied him with suspicion, his hand still near his belt as though half expecting trouble. He warned the farmer again of what he was choosing. He spoke of responsibility, of mistrust, of the way folks might look at him differently. But the farmer did not flinch. He simply reached into the worn pouch he carried and counted the coins with a rough patience that spoke of long days saving what little he could. Each piece struck the table with a dull clink, drawing eyes like moths to flame. When the last coin fell, the sheriff gathered them with a grunt, still watching the farmer as though trying to find the weakness in his resolve. He nodded once to the soldiers, and they untied the ropes. The woman's wrists were raw where the bindings had rubbed, yet she did not wince, did not rub her skin. She simply stood free, her head high, her expression the same mask of unbroken silence. The crowd thinned quickly after that. Some were muttering about foolish choices, some about danger, and others simply eager to leave the memory behind. In a land already heavy with ghosts, no one wanted to carry another. But the farmer did not move until the last of the dust settled and the street grew quiet again. Only then did he step forward, careful, slow, as if approaching a wild creature who might bolt at any moment. He did not reach for her arm. He did not speak. He only nodded toward his waiting wagon. She followed, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the street, the rooftops, the open sky above. She did not look at him, not yet. The farmer climbed into the wagon seat and took up the reins. The horses shifted, restless from the weight of all they had witnessed. He clicked his tongue softly, and the wagon creaked into motion, carrying them away from the town and its murmurs. The road stretched ahead in silence. Dust rose behind them, curling into the dry air like smoke. The farmer stole glances when he thought she would not notice, trying to read her face, trying to guess what storm might dwell behind her quiet. She sat tall, despite her weariness, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He thought of speaking, of offering food or water, of explaining himself, but each time the words died in his throat. He knew he had changed both their lives in that moment, yet he did not know if he had saved her or doomed himself. By the time the sun lowered toward the edge of the world, painting the land in fire and shadow, his small farm came into view. The house stood weathered but sturdy, its wood faded from years of wind and sun. The barn leaned slightly to one side, patched more than once by his own hand. The field stretched beyond, rows of soil waiting for rain that too often failed to come. It was not much, but it was all he had, and now it would be hers too if she chose to stay. He stopped the wagon near the house and stepped down, his boots sinking into the dry earth. She did not move until he motioned toward the door. Even then, she walked slowly, her eyes scanning every detail as though memorizing the shape of her new prison or her new refuge. He opened the door and let her pass inside first. The room was small, with a wooden table scarred by years of use, a bed tucked in the corner, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans and corn. It smelled of dust, old wood, and faint smoke from the hearth. She stood still, her eyes tracing the walls, the roof beams, the single window that opened toward the west. He set down a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread on the table, then stepped back, uncertain of what to do next. She approached the table, tore off a piece of bread, and ate without a word. Her hunger was clear, yet she did not rush. She ate with slow patience, as though each bite carried meaning. He watched, his arms folded, his throat dry. For years he had eaten at this table alone, the silence pressing against him like stone. Now, the silence was different, filled with a presence he did not yet understand. That night he lay awake long after the lamp burned out, listening to the wind press against the walls. He thought of her people, of stories told around campfires, of the endless struggle between settlers and the land's first guardians. He thought of the eyes that had followed him in town, eyes that would keep following, filled with judgment or suspicion. And he thought of her, the way she had carried herself with quiet strength, even when bound. She was not broken. He knew it, and that knowledge left him restless. Days passed, each one carrying the weight of unspoken things. She rose early, moving through the fields with him, silent yet steady, her hands learning the rhythm of planting and tending. She carried water, gathered wood, and worked with a determination that surprised him. She never asked, never complained. She simply did. Yet she did not look at him often, and when she did, her gaze was heavy, unreadable, as though she saw more of him than he wished revealed. The town did not stay silent either. When he went in for supplies, whispers followed him down every aisle of the store. Some muttered about his foolishness, others warned of trouble to come. A few even hinted at the dangers of a man living alone with such a woman under his roof. He did not answer, took his goods, paid what he owed, and left without a word. But each time he returned to the farm, the whispers clung to him like dust. One evening, after a long day, when the sky had burned red with the setting sun, he found her standing by the edge of the field, staring into the hills beyond. He knew those hills carried her memories, carried the ashes of her people, carried all that had been taken. He did not speak, but stood near, close enough for her to know he was there. The silence stretched between them, deep and unbroken, filled with questions neither dared to ask. Later that night, when he returned to the table, he found something carved faintly into the wood grain. It was a small mark, simple but deliberate, the kind of mark left by someone who wished to remember, someone who would not let their story vanish. He ran his fingers over it, tracing its rough edges, and knew it was her hand that had left it. He sat long in the dim light, staring at that mark, realizing that though she lived under his roof, she was not his. She belonged to a story far older than his farm, far larger than his loneliness. He had freed her with coins, But freedom was not something any man could grant with silver. It was something she carried within her, and whether she stayed or left, that truth would remain. Outside, the night stretched wide, stars scattered like cold fire across the sky. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to one another, their voices wild and mournful. He sat listening, his heart heavy with the weight of choices yet to come. Knowing that the story between them had only just begun, and that the hardest part still lay ahead. And in the stillness of that hour, as the wind brushed against the door and the hills whispered their secrets, he felt for the first time that his life had been set on a path he could not turn from. A path that might yet cost him everything he had left. The days rolled on, each one carrying a quiet weight that neither the farmer nor the Apache woman could name. The rhythm of the farm kept them busy. Dawn came with the sound of roosters, the creak of wooden buckets, and the groan of tired hinges. Fields needed tending, fences needed mending, animals needed feed. Yet beneath the work lay something unsettled, like a storm brewing just beyond the ridge. The farmer could feel it in the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, in the way she moved with a purpose that seemed to stretch beyond the rows of corn or the stacks of wood. She was present, but part of her lived elsewhere, tied to a past that still shadowed her every step. The whispers in town did not fade. If anything, they grew sharper with each passing week. Some said the farmer had brought trouble upon himself, that harboring an Apache woman would bring violence from those who still bore grudges. Others, more curious than cruel, wondered how she spent her days, whether she had spoken a word, whether she meant to stay. Each trip into town stretched longer, not for lack of supplies, but because of the eyes that followed him everywhere. The farmer bore it with silence, as he always had, but inside he carried a slow-burning unease. One afternoon, as he loaded sacks of grain into his wagon, a ranch hand from the neighboring valley stopped him. The man was broad-shouldered, with a grin that carried no kindness. He leaned against the wagon and spoke in a low tone, suggesting that the farmer should not keep her. He said the past could not be buried so easily, that some wounds cut too deep to heal. He warned that there were men who would not rest, knowing she walked free. The farmer listened without answering, his hands steady on the reins. The ranch hand's grin faded when he realized his words found no purchase, but his eyes promised that the matter was not closed. Back at the farm, the Apache woman continued her work with quiet determination. She rarely spoke, but her silence was not empty. It carried weight, like the silence of the hills, like the silence of graves where stories lay buried. One evening, as they sat at the table, she finally broke it. Her words were careful, her voice low, but clear. She asked why he had paid for her freedom. The farmer, caught off guard, searched for an answer. He could not say it was pity, for she was stronger than pity. He could not say it was loneliness, though that was true enough. At last he told her he had seen something in her eyes that day in town, something unbroken. He said he had lived too long surrounded by emptiness, and he did not want to live that way anymore. She listened, her gaze steady, then nodded once, and returned to her bread. Nothing more was said, but the space between them shifted, filled with a new, fragile understanding. Still, shadows pressed closer. One night coyotes howled from the hills, their cries sharp and restless. The farmer woke to the sound and found her standing at the window, watching the darkness as if expecting something more than wild animals. He asked if she had trouble sleeping, but she did not answer. Her silence told him enough. She was listening for more than coyotes. She was listening for footsteps, for riders, for the return of something that had not yet come. The next morning, while working the field, the farmer noticed tracks near the edge of his land. Hoof prints fresh and deep, as if riders had passed close in the night. His stomach tightened. He knew the ranch hand's warning had not been idle talk. There were men who watched, who wondered, who perhaps waited for their moment. He said nothing to her, not wanting to stir fear, but he knew she had already sensed it. Her eyes missed little. Meanwhile, a different conflict stirred within the farmer himself. He found his thoughts drifting more and more toward her, not with simple curiosity, but with a pull he could not explain. He admired her strength, the way she carried herself with dignity despite all that had been taken. He respected her silence, her patience, her ability to endure. Yet he also knew that trust between them was fragile, that her heart belonged to a people and a past that no man could replace. Each time their eyes met across the field or the table, he felt both closeness and distance, like standing at the edge of a canyon, reaching toward something just beyond his grasp. Another layer of tension grew from the land itself. The season was turning dry again, the soil cracking under the sun, the crops wilting before they could grow strong. The farmer had seen such years before, years that tested every ounce of will a man had. But this time, he was not alone in it. She carried buckets, hauled water from the creek, and worked until her hands were raw. Together they fought the drought, but even together, they could not change the sky. Some evenings, when the clouds passed without rain, he caught a flicker of pain in her eyes, as though the earth's suffering mirrored her own. Subplots wove themselves into the fabric of their days. A boy from town began visiting, bringing messages from the blacksmith or running errands for his mother. He was no more than 12, full of questions and energy. At first he was shy around her, uncertain of the stories he had heard. But soon curiosity won over, and he asked her about the hills, about the old ways, about what she remembered. She rarely answered, but sometimes she would hum a tune low under her breath, and the boy would sit still, listening as though it were the first true sound he had ever heard. The farmer watched these moments carefully, knowing how icily tongues in town could twist innocence into suspicion. Tension also stirred with the neighboring rancher, the same man who had spoken to him before. The rancher began driving his cattle closer to the farmer's land, as if testing boundaries. He let fences break, let water troughs run dry, and always wore that same thin smile when their paths crossed. The farmer understood what it meant. It was not only cattle he was pushing, it was a warning, a claim, a sign that trouble was drawing near. Through it all, the woman remained steady. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. One evening, she told the farmer that in her people's way, land was not something to own, but something to live with, something shared between all who walked upon it. The farmer listened, his hands rough from the plow, his back sore from years of toil, and for the first time he questioned the soil beneath him. Had he ever truly owned it, or had he simply borrowed it from those who came before? The story of their days deepened in small ways. She carved patterns into wood scraps, shapes that spoke of rivers and mountains, of spirits and journeys. The farmer kept them, lining them on a shelf, though he did not know what they meant. Sometimes at night, he heard her whisper in her own tongue. Words carried softly to the firelight, words he could not understand, but that filled the air with a sense of something larger than either of them. Yet, for every moment of quiet connection, there was an equal shadow of looming conflict. Men still rode the hills, leaving tracks near his land. The rancher still tested his fences. The drought pressed harder. And beneath it all, the farmer felt the stirrings of his own heart, dangerous in their own right. He had taken her from the edge of despair, but he knew he could not expect gratitude, nor love, nor belonging. She was more than the price he had paid. She was a story, a history, a reminder that some wounds could not heal with silver or soil. One night, as thunder rumbled faint in the distance but no rain came, the farmer sat at the table staring at the mark she had carved weeks before. She entered the room quietly, her shadow falling across him. For the first time she spoke of her people, of the raids, of the nights in the mountains, when the fire burned low and children clung to their mothers. She spoke not with tears but with a steady voice, as though speaking kept the memory alive. The farmer listened, his chest tight, knowing that each word was both a gift and a wound. When her voice fell silent again, the room seemed heavier, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Outside, the coyotes howled once more, and this time their cries carried an edge sharper than before, as if warning of a danger creeping closer. The farmer met her eyes across the table, and in them he saw the reflection of his own fear. The storm had not yet broken, but it was near. And so they waited, each night heavier than the last, knowing that the land, the people, and the past all pressed in around them, and that soon the choice he had made would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The summer dragged on dry and unforgiving, the kind of season that seemed to test every living thing under the sun. The farmer woke each morning with the taste of dust in his mouth, his throat raw from breathing the air that never seemed to cool. Fields withered no matter how much water they carried, and the earth cracked like broken glass beneath their boots. He told himself that he had lived through such years before, that he could do it again, but this year felt different. the land was not the only thing under strain. The eyes of the town, the pressure from the rancher, the silent strength of the Apache woman beside him, all of it pressed closer with each passing day, until it seemed the farm itself was holding its breath. The boy from town came less often. His mother had heard whispers and forbade him to visit, though sometimes he still wandered near, calling out shy greetings from the road. The farmer always waved him off kindly, but inside he worried. Even innocent curiosity was dangerous now. Too many tongues had been wagging, and each word spoken seemed to add weight to the storm building around them. The woman, however, never scolded the boy. When he appeared, she would pause in her work, hum one of her low songs, and let him sit a while, as if she knew the memory might be all he carried into manhood. The rancher's presence grew bolder. At first, it had been stray cattle and broken fences. Now it was riders lingering on the ridge, their outlines sharp against the fading sun, watching the farmhouse like hawks circling a rabbit. The farmer pretended not to see, but at night he lay awake, hearing the creak of the barn and the shuffle of horses, wondering if they would come down before dawn. His shotgun stayed by the door, cleaned and ready, though he hoped each night would pass without need for it. One evening, as he mended a section of fence, he heard the sharp crack of a branch in the woods nearby. He froze, the hammer still in his hand, his breath shallow. Slowly, he turned, scanning the trees. For a long moment there was nothing, only the rustle of leaves in the hot wind. Then he saw a flash of movement, a rider slipping through the shadows, watching. The farmer met the eyes of the stranger across the distance, and though no words were spoken, the message was clear. They were not hiding anymore. When he returned to the house, he found her sitting at the table, her back straight, her eyes on the door before he even stepped through. She knew. She had felt the same weight pressing in. Without speaking, he placed the shotgun on the table and set his jaw. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as though confirming what she already understood. That night, neither of them slept. The drought grew worse, and with it, tempers in town. People grew restless, blaming one another for things beyond their control. Wells dried, crops failed, and cattle weakened in the heat. The farmer could feel the unease every time he hitched his wagon to buy flour or seed. Whispers turned into stares, and stares turned into pointed questions. Why had he brought her here? Why keep her when others had been sent away? Was he hiding something? Each accusation hung unspoken but heavy, carried in the way men crossed the street when he passed. The woman felt it too. She rarely went to town, but when she did, eyes followed her like arrows. Children clung to their mothers, men stood taller, and women whispered behind their hands. Yet she did not bow her head. She walked through the dust with the same quiet strength she always carried, and though her silence made them uneasy, it also made them wary. The farmer watched her closely on those trips, afraid someone might do more than whisper. But she seemed to know when to look away, when to keep walking, when to meet their eyes, and when not to. One night, as lightning flickered far away but no rain came, the boy from town appeared at their door, his small chest heaving with breath. He said he had overheard men talking at the saloon. They planned to ride out, to deal with what they called a problem once and for all. The farmer's stomach turned cold. He asked how many, but the boy could only shake his head. Too many, he said. Enough to make trouble. The woman stood in the shadows, listening, her face unreadable. When the boy left, she turned to the farmer and said simply, "They are coming." The days that followed dragged like heavy chains. Each sound of hoofbeats in the distance set the farmer's nerves on edge. Each rider passing on the road made him wonder if tonight was the night. He tried to keep working, tried to pretend the farm was still just a farm, but the truth lay in every shadow stretching long at dusk. They were waiting, watching, planning. The rancher made his move clearer. He rode up one morning with two of his men, stopping at the fence line. His smile was thin, his eyes hard. He told the farmer it wasn't safe, that harboring her would bring ruin. He said men were talking, men who would not rest until the matter was settled. He spoke as though offering advice, but the threat in his tone was sharp as barbed wire. The farmer stood his ground, saying only that this was his land, his home, and what happened on it was his choice. The rancher leaned closer in his saddle, his grin turning cruel. He said choices had consequences, then turned and rode off, his men laughing behind him. That evening, the woman carved another mark into the table. This one was longer, deeper, as though her hand pressed harder than before. The farmer watched her from across the room, his chest tight. He wanted to ask what it meant, but he already knew. It was not just memory now, it was preparation. The farm became a place of waiting. The animals sensed it, restless in their stalls. The wind carried it, sharp and tense. The farmer worked with more urgency, stacking wood, checking fences, hauling water, though he knew none of it would matter if the men from town truly came. The woman moved with the same quiet purpose, gathering herbs, sharpening tools, setting things in order as though bracing for a storm that could not be turned aside. Then came the night when the hills seemed alive with sound. Horses snorted in the distance, their hooves dull against the earth. Voices carried low through the dark, the kind of murmurs men used when they thought they went unheard. The farmer stood at the window, shotgun in hand, his heart hammering like a drum. She stood beside him, calm, steady, her eyes fixed on the same horizon. In the faint glow of the moon, he saw the outline of riders gathering on the ridge, their figures black against the sky. The air grew thick, the silence between hoofbeats heavy with promise. This was no longer rumor, no longer whispers in town or threats at the fence line. The storm had arrived, and it was waiting just beyond his field. He tightened his grip on the gun, sweat damp on his palms, while beside him the woman lifted her chin, her face unyielding. The riders did not move that night. They lingered, watching, their presence a shadow cast over the farmhouse until dawn. When the sun finally rose, they were gone, leaving only churned earth and the memory of their silence. But the message was clear: they could come whenever they chose, and the farmer knew it would not be long. The tension wound tighter with each day that followed. Even the sound of the creek seemed sharper, the cry of a hawk overhead more urgent. The farmer felt himself stretched thin, torn between fear and resolve, between the life he had built and the life he had chosen the moment he freed her. She, meanwhile, grew more present, more vivid, as if the danger called forth a strength she had always carried, but never shown. At times, she would stand in the fields with the wind lifting her hair, her posture tall and unbending, as though she were calling back to something greater than either of them. The farmer knew the climax was near. The ranchers' threats, the whispers in town, the riders on the ridge, they all pointed to one end. He could feel it in his bones each time he stepped outside, each time the sun sank behind the hills. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would break. And on one restless evening, when the sky glowed red with the last light of day and the first stars crept into the dark, the farmer heard it at last, the thunder of hooves rolling toward his land, not distant this time, but close, too close. He stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand, his body tense, his heart pounding. Beside him, the Apache woman stood tall, her eyes sharp, her silence carrying more strength than any word he could speak. The sound grew louder, the earth trembling beneath it, until the night itself seemed ready to split open. The storm he had feared, the storm he had felt building all these months, was no longer at the edge of the hills. It was here. The morning after the storm, the land lay quiet under a pale sky. The farmhouse stood still, its walls weathered but strong. And inside it, the farmer and the Apache woman sat together at the old wooden table, listening to the wind settle over the fields. The air no longer carried the sound of boots, guns, or threats. The chaos had passed, and with it the weight of fear that had haunted them for so long seemed to lift, though both knew that scars, seen and unseen, do not fade overnight. The farmer looked at his calloused hands, roughened by years of toil, and then glanced at the woman across from him. She sat tall, despite all she had endured, her dark eyes reflecting the quiet strength of the mountains she had once called home. For the first time since she had stepped onto his land, her face held no tension. He wondered what freedom felt like to her now. She had been taken, traded, and nearly broken by the world's cruelty, yet here she was, still unyielding. The townsfolk had retreated after the last confrontation, leaving whispers behind, but not daring to challenge the farmer anymore. Perhaps it was the gunfire of the night before, or perhaps it was simply the look in his eyes that warned them to stay away. Whatever the reason, the farm had become a place of peace again, and no one dared disturb it. Still, questions hung in the air like unsettled dust. Could they truly find a life together when the world outside did not understand them? Could the farmer hold on to what he had fought for? Or would the old prejudices of others return to test them once again? Days passed, and with each sunrise, their routines grew steadier. She tended the garden with patience, planting seeds as if she were laying roots for herself as well. He worked the fields, often pausing to see her kneel in the soil, her hands moving with care. There was something in the way she touched the earth, as though she belonged to it more deeply than anyone else. Slowly, the silence between them softened, replaced by small words, gestures, and the trust that had taken shape under fire. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the horizon in fire, he found her standing by the edge of the cornfield. She held a feather in her hand, one she had kept hidden until now. He asked her what it meant, and though her words were few, he understood that it was a memory of her people, a reminder of who she had been before chains and cruelty had tried to take it away. She pressed the feather into his hand, and in that moment he knew she was sharing not just her past, but her future. The farm began to change. Birds returned to the trees, the cattle grew strong, and for the first time in many seasons, the soil seemed generous. Neighbors who had once turned away started to notice from a distance, watching how the farmer and the Apache woman worked side by side. Some whispered disapproval, others quiet respect. A few even came forward, offering cautious greetings and trade. The farmer never explained, and she never bowed her head. They simply lived, and in doing so proved that peace was possible even in a land marked by division. Still, there were reminders of the past that lingered. At night, she sometimes woke from dreams that left her breathless, her eyes searching the darkness for dangers that were no longer there. He would sit near her until her breathing steadied, saying nothing, only making sure she knew she was not alone. In those quiet hours, he realized that true freedom was not just about breaking chains. It was about healing, about choosing to walk forward when every part of the past begged to pull you back. When spring came, wildflowers stretched across the hills, and with them came a sense of renewal neither had expected. The farmer stood on the porch, watching her weave strands of grass into patterns, her face lit by the warmth of the day. He thought of how lonely he had once been, how empty his days had felt before she came into his life. What he had done for her, paying for her freedom when no one else dared to, had been born of compassion, but it had grown into something far greater. She had given his life meaning again. One afternoon, a rider came from town, carrying a letter from the sheriff. The farmer read it with steady eyes. The law had decided there would be no further questions about the Apache woman, no more disputes or claims. The words were brief, but they meant everything. For the first time since her capture, she was recognized not as property, but as free. He showed her the letter, and though she did not weep, he could see the weight lift from her shoulders. She looked at him then, and in her silence was gratitude, though also something deeper, something that spoke of the bond they had built in struggle and trust. With freedom came choices. She could leave if she wished, return to the lands of her people if any still remained, or seek her own path elsewhere. But when he asked her gently what she wanted, she simply stayed. Day after day, she chose the farm, the soil, and the quiet strength of their shared life. For him, that was more powerful than any vow. As the years turned, their story became a quiet legend. Travelers spoke of the lonely farmer who had once paid for the freedom of the last Apache woman, and how the two of them built a life together in defiance of fear and prejudice. Some told it as a tale of courage, others as a lesson in compassion. But those who knew them best said it was simply a story of two people who found each other when the world had nearly broken them. The fields grew rich, the farmhouse sturdy, and the land around them thrived. Children would sometimes run past their fence, laughing, their parents calling them back, though always with a softer tone than before. Slowly, the land itself seemed to accept what once had seemed impossible. In the evenings, as the farmer sat on his porch with the Apache woman by his side, he often thought back to the day he had first seen her in town, standing in the shadows while others looked away. No one had claimed her because no one had seen her as human, but he had, and that single act had changed both their lives forever. Their story was not about grand victories or battles won. It was about survival, about the courage to defy loneliness and fear, and about the healing power of compassion. The farmer had once lived in silence, and she had once lived in chains. But together, they created something that outlasted both. The land carried their legacy in the whisper of the wheat, in the strength of the fences, in the quiet peace of the nights. And though time would one day pass them by, the story of the last Apache woman and the lonely farmer would remain. A reminder that sometimes freedom is not just given, but built, and that love, in its truest form, is an act of courage.